all the questions, a rich pool of questions. I'll try to answer those that were directed at me and maybe touch on a couple others. The question about African justice systems and their applicability to Sudan, great question. And the answer is there's a rich history in African nations of holding perpetrators of international crimes to account. And you mentioned some of them, certainly. Domestic options in Sudan, likely unavailable. I think that's pretty clear that currently domestic courts in Sudan are not willing or able to hold perpetrators to account. So we have to look elsewhere. We have to look at other countries' domestic courts through principles of universal jurisdiction like we've talked about today, or also regional mechanisms like the African Commission of Human and People's Rights. Clearly, you've noted correctly some issues with the enforcement of some of those orders and enforcement of those judgments, and that's an ongoing concern. And as far as I understand, enforcement of those orders is a matter of political pressure, and what kind of pressure can we put on commissioners to make sure those orders are effectively communicated to states and that states are obligated to then abide by them. But there's also a tradition, right, of hybrid courts and internationalized courts. We saw in Sierra Leone that happened, the Special Court of Sierra Leone with the Habre trials in Senegal. Obviously, we have the ICTR as well. So there are other options out there. I think from our analysis, we're looking at universal jurisdiction, at legal action worldwide. That seems to us to be the most promising of the different avenues that we're looking at for our clients in Sudan, for the victims that we've talked to. And that's in part because of the great groundwork that Wayamo and partners have been doing to have these conversations with local judges and prosecutors and civil society actors in the region. And there's no reason why, this came up yesterday in our conversations, but there's no reason why UJ has to stay in Europe. You know, we've shown clearly that there's capacity for it here in Africa and elsewhere in Argentina. But we're excited for the promise of UJ to be fulfilled here, perhaps in Kenya, to give some measure of justice to those Sudanese victims who can't get justice at home. Just very quickly, there was a comment about focusing on crimes in West Darfur and why the focus there, why can't we look at crimes elsewhere? I just wanted to add to that obviously the ICC is limited to Darfur, that's their current geographical mandate, but universal jurisdiction is not limited in that way, and that's something we're also taking into consideration, looking at crimes happening elsewhere, you know, in Khartoum, in Kordofan, and Al Jazeera states, so we're not just limited to Darfur when looking at universal jurisdiction remedies. There was a question as well, quickly on SGBV and women and girls, and that's something we're also very focused on, and with our partnership with SIHA, of course, looking to center the voices of those female survivors of sexual violence. They're horrific stories we're hearing, and all too many victims, and hoping to center their voices in our litigation as well. I think I'll end there, but yeah. Oh.
She had asked, why are you only focusing on West Sudan with SIHA?
Oh. Yeah. So we're looking at, in particular with SIHA? Oh. So currently our program, which is just getting started, is looking at those refugees coming into Adre and looking at a specific center there and interviewing survivors and providing them with psychosocial services and other referral services. And so far, to my knowledge, that the women that we've talked to from that center are coming from West Sudan, from West Darfur, and that's why the pool of evidence suggests that. But that doesn't mean that we're limited to representing survivors from a particular region in our cases. We've been in active conversations with other NGOs, including several in the room, about representing clients from other areas as well.
So some of the questions that I'd like to tackle, the first one is a great question concerning the impact of Omdurman National Bank, or investigating Omdurman National Bank and Al Khalij National Bank. And I think it really touches upon, one, being able to identify key conflict financiers or potential conflict financiers, key conflict enablers or potential conflict enablers, and their networks in which they use to perpetuate and continue that financing, because that falls into the Sudanese kind of war economy, as it's known today. And being able to have those institutions, those shell companies, those individuals move wealth and resources in and out of the country and circulate within the country is really kind of to identify that is really helpful. One, and two, it allows us to follow up on their activities. So being able to look at things like trade data, corporate registry information, being able to look at the different asset structures of these individuals and their entities. Who are the shareholders of those companies? Where do those shareholders have interests? Do those individuals have interests in other countries that are potentially connected to the conflict? For example, through our work, we've been able to identify several politically exposed persons in Sudan that have had, for example, property in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai through our Sandcastles, which is our Dubai Property Land Registry database. And we've been able to use that information to help follow up on the activities of these entities. So even after a potential enforcement action occurs, the work doesn't stop. And so that, I think, is where the impact is, because you want to continue to target the nodes, the key nodes that help these entities operate, but also potential branches of funding, potential branches of development, or potential assets that they might have that are not publicly declared, that might be hidden or obfuscated through one way or another. Secondly, to the question on the sharing of information from our colleague, we share information in a variety of ways. We do that through public reports, like you see on our website. One of our most recent reports is called Unearthed, and it covers the malign activities of the Wagner PMC in the gold mining sector in Sudan, and how they use banks, Western banks, and big conglomerates to move around their finances and move, gold and resources in and out of Sudan, and in CAR as well. So we share our information in public reports, but we also have memorandums of understanding with partners. We also help and support share data with partners who follow the same mission and have the same kind of values as we do. We've shared cuts of trade data before, corporate registry data that's been hard to get. We have over 1 million records on Sudan alone, 1 million rows of records on Sudan just alone, and that encompasses so many documents that might or probably would have been lost throughout in our platform called Seamless Horizons. It's our data lake, basically, that we have, and we call it our internal Google. And so we share Seamless Horizons licenses with partners through an email, and we have them sign up for an account. And if they're interested, we train them in how to use it. We provide those resources, and then they're able to have access to over 2 billion plus rows of data. And all of those contain primary source documentation, documentation from third-party aggregators, and so on and so forth. So there's a really wide variety of data that we can share to our partners. We can share to our folks that are working on the ground. And also it works the other way as well, in kind of Seamless Horizons, as well as, for example, our Sudan Shahid map act as good areas to help manage and store that data. For example, in Seamless Horizons, you have the ability to upload an OCR data and images. So if you upload a picture or if you upload a PDF that is not initially searchable in Seamless Horizons, you can do that and it'll make it searchable. So there are a lot of benefits to using Seamless Horizons, but also being able to follow up on investigations like Durman, because you can see in Seamless Horizons previous data that we've gathered, current data that we're gathering. And then lastly, on the addressing your question on kind of how do we follow up on corruption in the animal resources, for example, sector, or the gold sector. And I would say it's really important to continue to monitor and continue to follow up on the kind of activities of the entities using PAI. So looking at what's coming in trade records, what's going on their particular social medias. Has their website changed? What are the annual reports currently and previously? Using tools, for example, something as simple as the Wayback Machine to view old versions of a particular website can provide insight into changes of an entity, a natural person, or a greater organization. Being able to look at flight data, maritime tracking, seeing what kind of ships are visiting particular ports, what might they be shipping, and combining that and layering the data with something like commercial satellite imagery so you can get an image of the particular ship. And the point that I'm really driving on here is that it's about layering the data together, because just like not one piece of evidence sometimes may not be enough, it applies in the same way that one piece of data is not enough. The way that we put together such, investigations that we specialize in is by, again, layering our data science, our cutting-edge emerging technologies like Seamless Horizons, like the Sudan Shahid map, and layering that with our analysis, merging that all together, and layering all the data pieces into one puzzle and fitting all those pieces together. So that's hopefully answers your question. So in regards to your question on SGBV and OSINT, it's a very complex subject, and I don't think it can be answered in sort of one sentence here or there. So I would ask you to follow up with me, and we can have kind of a deeper discussion about that and what that could potentially look like. Thank you.
I'll be brief, and then I'm going to cede the rest of my time to Pubudu. So Pubudu, beware. I think you're right to point out that sanctions are inherently political, and I definitely don't want to overstate their effectiveness or their value. I think it's one tool of many, and I think anybody who has been sanctioned would testify that they aren't. It's not nice to be sanctioned. And I think you can see by the acts of Hemeti and others how desperately they tried to avoid that in fact it is something that, makes the commission of crimes and the lives of those who are allegedly responsible for crimes a bit more difficult, which was what we were talking about, right? It's one tool of many to get in the way and disrupt criminal activity. The other thing you said was, how do we increase cooperation on arrest warrants? So, and I think that's along the lines of what we were discussing with respect to building the network. I think if alleged perpetrators are traveling to countries where the civil society in that country isn't necessarily aware of what's taking place in Sudan, isn't aware that they're traveling, they can come in and out before anyone is ready to mobilize and act. And therefore, especially in contexts where there's no political will to act, I think that can explain a lot of the instances where we have seen arrest warrants not acted upon. But again, in situations where we have civil society who are ready, who are aware of what's going on, we have seen people who have arrest warrants against them fleeing these jurisdictions, sometimes in quite embarrassing ways, in order to avoid being captured and arrested. So, I think we just need to continue to work on this, right, and build that network in order to get compliance on these arrest warrants. Now, Pubudu, I think a couple of the questions that I really think someone from the ICC who currently works there should answer. The idea that the ICC should develop its own police force, I think we should have a clear answer on that and the likelihood of that happening. There was also the talk about Ali Kushayb and why only one case. And then there was something about making use of the ICC during during a conflict in resolution, I think 1325.
So yes, unfortunately, based on the way the international system works now, it's not possible for the ICC to have its own police force. That's because of the concerns about sovereignty, etc., that were in the minds of states in 1998 when the treaty was being negotiated. So what you have in the ICC is a court which is really reliant on cooperation. Okay? That doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It doesn't mean that it cannot function, because every time we have arrested someone, or many occasions that we have arrested someone, Mr. Jean-Pierre Bemba, Mr. Dominic Ongwen, a number of people, we've cooperated with domestic police, domestic militaries, and even international bodies to obtain arrests of individuals. So unfortunately, we do not have our own police force, and it's unlikely that we will have our own enforcement authority in the near future. But there are definitely options along the lines of which Mikel already mentioned, where we can, state parties are obliged to cooperate with the ICC, and so there is an obligation on them to arrest. Of course, we all know that legal obligation and political will are two different things, but in that latter context is where civil society action becomes really important. It is indeed possible to put pressure on states to carry out arrests. And at the very least, it's possible to put pressure on states to not accept within their territory somebody who is subject to an ICC arrest warrant. Why is the Kosheb case the only case that we have done relating to Sudan? Good question. That is because we were able to obtain the surrender of Mr. Kosheb, and we have not been able to obtain the surrender of Mr. Harun, Mr. Hussein, and Mr. Bashir. That is something on which we are working on a daily basis. And unfortunately, because we don't have a police force, we are reliant on the cooperation of the states in which these individuals are. So everything that this panel discussed about how to encourage surrender of those suspects, I think applies to the Sudan context. I know that's not a satisfactory answer. It's not a satisfactory answer for me either. Even though the ICC investigates a variety of types of crimes, the current prosecutor and the management of the Office of the Prosecutor has been very clear that we focus heavily on gender-based crimes and crimes against children. Now, I know that gender-based crimes are not only perpetrated against women, but it is of course true that a vast number of gender-based crimes are perpetrated against women. So this focus is also aimed at women, peace, and security. This being said, the ICC has a narrow mandate. We are supposed to work on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, aggression. So when working on women, peace, and security, the justice pillar is only one pillar. We must also, and this has become very clear to me when meeting refugees in Chad, you must also ensure food stability, general security of, general physical security, access to healthcare, and access to education. And these factors work together in a combination, and the ICC can only work on one or two of these factors. That's something that civil society activists should also bear in mind as well. I think I'll stop there.
I'm going to respond very briefly because I have a plane to catch. So there were three main questions dealing with state sovereignty, immunities, what happens when a country is not an ICC member. Zimbabwe is not a member of the ICC, and yet a successful universal jurisdiction case was brought in South Africa. So for the purposes of universal jurisdiction, a state does not have to be a member of the ICC. So that's an important thing to bear in mind. There was a question about immunities. In the al-Bashir case in South Africa, the courts were very clear that even if you are a head of state, if you have been involved in the commission of international crimes, you cannot rely on head of state immunity to protect you. So that is also an important consideration. That may differ from court to court, but there's already a strong precedent which states that head of state immunity may not protect you if you've committed international crimes. And then there was a question about the abuse of universal jurisdiction. So an example would have been helpful, but I think just to comment on that, we cannot, as civil society, as individuals, we cannot prevent people from filing universal jurisdiction cases. We're trying to encourage the filing of universal jurisdiction cases. So if there's a case filed and you think that it's going in the wrong direction, my suggestion would be to intervene in such a case, or get somebody who is appropriate to intervene in that case, to make an amicus intervention, to make submissions to the court, if you think the court needs to be aware of information that's not before it. Does that answer you?
I'd like to give my thanks to the panel for your wonderful contributions. We've had everything from physics, Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, that we need to act. Just because perpetrators are committing these crimes and have these networks doesn't mean that we can't also form our own networks, that we can't also act. I think those are very, very powerful words from Michael that we can conclude with. And of course, we've also heard about the power of collaboration, working together. All of us who are sitting in this room, I think Tina earlier had given this call to action, and what she had talked about is how all of these little actions, today we've heard a lot about different mechanisms, the challenges with these mechanisms, but it doesn't mean that just because each of these mechanisms have their weaknesses, that that this is not going to work. It just simply means that they contribute towards a trajectory which leads us to justice.